The word Aravith used in public was restoration. She had chosen it with care, the way she chose all her public language, for its accuracy, its weight, and the specific quality it had of being entirely true while containing, within its architecture, more than it initially appeared to. Restoration was accurate. The Sorvani had been diminished. The trade corridor adjustment of 43 years ago, conducted by a human diplomatic mission operating under instructions that had been subsequently declassified, and were now available in any serious political archive, had restructured the mid-sector resource agreements in ways that were commercially advantageous to three human-aligned systems, and structurally damaging to Sorvani economic infrastructure in ways that took 11 years to fully manifest and another decade to stop manifesting. The human mission had known this was a likely outcome. The documentation confirmed it. The protests filed by the Sorvani diplomatic corps had been received, acknowledged, and acted upon in no material sense. Aravith had been 12 years old when the consequences arrived in her city. She had watched her mother, who had been a mid-tier trade administrator, spend 3 years managing the impossible arithmetic of a system whose foundation had been quietly removed. She had watched the city recalibrate itself around an absence it hadn't chosen. She had watched the official response from the human systems, sympathetic in language, negligible in substance, and understood, at 12, with the clarity that injustice produces in people who are paying close enough attention, that the language and the substance were not the same thing and that the difference between them was where power lived. She had been paying attention ever since. In the 30 years between 12 and the Ascension, she had built something, not a weapon, not an army, but the rarer and more durable thing that patient, intelligent grievance produces when the person carrying it is also brilliant. An understanding. A complete, structural, architectural understanding of exactly how the human-Sorvani relationship worked, where its weight was distributed, which points bore load and which were decorative, and what would happen if the load-bearing points were quietly, gradually, legally, and entirely defensibly adjusted. Her advisors called it strategy. She called it, in the private language of her own thinking, something more honest. She did not share the more honest word with her advisors because advisors needed strategy and she needed them to believe that strategy was what she had. In a human diplomatic analysis office that was smaller than its responsibilities warranted and fluorescently lit, in a way that suggested the facility budget had peaked some years ago, Stellan Voss was staring at a pattern. The pattern had taken 3 weeks to assemble, which was not because the pieces were hidden, but because each piece was individually unremarkable, and the habit of looking at things individually was the central structural weakness of the human diplomatic analysis apparatus, in Stellan's considered opinion. He had been offering this opinion for 4 years to people who received it with the tolerant attention reserved for analysts who were good at their jobs and occasionally exhausting. He was good at his job. He was also, on this particular Tuesday, exhausting in a way that he felt was proportionate to the situation. The Sorvani trade corridor renegotiations were proceeding through standard channels. The scientific cooperation review was routine. The diplomatic appointment cycles were within normal parameters. The cultural exchange program adjustments were minor. The resource agreement supplementary clauses were technical. The arbitration panel nominations were procedural. Individually, each item was a memo. Collectively, they were a blueprint. He had drawn the blueprint on a large surface in his office with the specific, slightly manic energy of a man who has seen something and cannot unsee it, and had been standing in front of it for 2 hours, and had found that standing in front of it for 2 hours had not made it less alarming. He requested a briefing with his director at 4 o'clock. His director was a careful, experienced official named Aurel who had spent 20 years in human-Sorvani relations and was deeply familiar with Stellan's tendency to find patterns. "Tell me the military posture," Aurel said. "Normal," Stellan said. "Territorial movements." "None. Communication escalations, threat language, any of the standard indicators." "Nothing," Stellan said. "That's the point. There's nothing that triggers the protocols. There doesn't need to be, because the protocols are looking for the wrong shape. She's not building a weapon, she's adjusting the architecture." Aurel looked at the blueprint. "Each one of these," Stellan said, "is individually within Sorvani rights to adjust. Each one is legally defensible." Each one has a stated rationale that is technically accurate, and each one is positioned at exactly the point in the relationship structure that bears the most load. He paused. In 11 years, if nothing changes, the human systems that depend on the mid-sector agreements will be operating on terms that the Sorvani set, through a process that we participated in and signed off on at every stage. Aurel was quiet for a long moment. You're describing an extremely patient legal strategy. I'm describing exactly what was done to them 43 years ago, Stellan said, in reverse, with interest. Aurel looked at the blueprint for a long time. Write it up, he said. I'll review it. Stellan wrote it up. It was 42 pages. Aurel reviewed the executive summary and the first 8 pages, and told Stellan that the analysis was interesting, but the evidence for intent was circumstantial, which was true, and that the appropriate response was continued monitoring, which was what continued monitoring always was when something was too uncomfortable to be addressed at the scale it required. Stellan went back to his office and began writing a longer document. The longer document reached a senior official named Dara Shen through a chain of routing that involved 2 colleagues who had read it, one of whom had found it alarming, and one of whom had found it alarming enough to forward it upward rather than sideways. Dara Shen read all 42 pages of the original and the additional 19 of the supplementary analysis, and requested a meeting with Stellan that lasted 3 hours and produced, at its end, something that Stellan's clearance level did not technically entitle him to, an entry in a formal diplomatic exchange program with a Sorvani Cultural Liaison Office that was currently staffed by a senior Sorvani official named Verath. Verath was composed, precise, and in possession of a thoroughness that Stellan recognized as the professional characteristic of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had stopped finding it necessary to perform how seriously they took it. She knew his analysis. He understood this within the first 15 minutes from the quality of her responses, the specific way she answered questions that he had not yet asked, which was either extraordinary preparation or familiarity with his thinking that went beyond the standard briefing. He tested this hypothesis twice during the meeting. It held both times. "You've read my documents," he said, in the second hour, not an accusation. "I've read your published analyses and several that were not published," she said, with the equanimity of someone confirming a fact they see no reason to obscure. "They are unusually accurate." "Unusually," he said. "For someone working from the outside," she said, "with incomplete information." He looked at her. "How incomplete?" "Less than you would expect," she said, "more than you'd prefer." He thought about this. "Why are you telling me that?" Verath was quiet for a moment. She had the specific quality of someone who is delivering a message and has been thinking about how to deliver it correctly for some time. "Because," she said, "the person whose thinking produced the architecture you identified has found it meaningful to be accurately understood, and has decided that accurate understanding, in this case, is worth the acknowledgement." Stellan sat with this for a moment. "She's been reading my analysis," he said. "Yes," Verath said, "and she wanted me to know that." "She wanted you to know," Verath said carefully, "that what you found is what you think it is, and that the person who built it is not uninterested in a conversation with someone who could see it clearly." The conversation happened 3 weeks later, at the Sorvani diplomatic mission, in a meeting room that was formally designated as a cultural exchange discussion, and was, in actual substance, the most significant conversation Stellan Voss had ever been in a room for. Arevith of the Sorvani was not what he had assembled from the political documentation, which was itself more than most people had. She was younger than her historical weight suggested, and more composed than he had prepared for, the specific composure of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has made peace with the weight of it, not by setting it down, but by becoming strong enough that it no longer showed. She let him speak first, which he understood was not courtesy, but assessment. He said what he had come to say directly, because directness was what the situation required, and because he had spent enough time studying someone who said exactly what she meant to have absorbed the habit. "I know what you built," he said. "I know why you built it. I know the documentation behind the why, and I understand that the documentation is accurate. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong about the history." She looked at him with the full, direct attention of someone who has been waiting for a conversation to begin properly. Then, what are you here to tell me? She said. I'm here to ask you a question, he said. Ask. 43 years ago, he said, a human diplomatic mission made decisions in its own interest that damaged your civilization. The damage was real. The failure to address it was real. The injustice of it is documented and accurate. He paused. What you built in response is legal, patient, and architecturally elegant, and in 11 years it will have done to the mid-sector human systems approximately what was done to yours. He looked at her. And then what? She was very still. Then the accounting is settled, she said. Is it? He said. The damage will have been matched, she said. The scale will have been established. The principle that actions have consequences will have been demonstrated in terms that cannot be dismissed as protest or ignored as sentiment. And the relationship between your civilization and mine, he said, will be a relationship between two civilizations that have each diminished the other's infrastructure in the mid-sector, and that have 30 years of carefully constructed legal grievance on both sides, and that have demonstrated to each other and to every observing system in the corridor that the thing to do when wronged is to build the most patient, elegant version of the same wrong in return. He paused. I'm asking what comes after that, not morally, practically. What does the relationship look like in 20 years? What does the corridor look like in 30? Aravith looked at him with an expression that had too many layers to read quickly and that he suspected was not often seen on her face by people who were not her. You're not here to tell me to forgive, she said. It was not quite a question. I'm not, he said. The history is what it is. The grievance is legitimate. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. Then what are you asking? I'm asking, he said carefully, whether the architecture you've spent 30 years building is the thing you want to leave behind. Whether the most accurate description of your reign, in 40 years, is that you made human systems feel what Sorvani systems felt. Whether that's the shape of the legacy. He held her gaze. Because you're intelligent enough to have already asked yourself this question, and I think the reason you let me into this room is that you haven't been able to finish answering it. The room was very quiet. Outside, the diplomatic mission continued its formal operations with the patient efficiency of an institution that had been designed for exactly this kind of meeting and was entirely unaware of what this particular one contained. She was quiet for a long time. He did not fill the silence because the silence was working. I was 12 years old, she said, finally, not as an explanation, as a fact placed carefully on the table between them. I know, he said. The city recalibrated itself around something that had been taken from it, she said. The people who took it were apologetic in language. They were negligible in substance. I know, he said again. You cannot ask me to be indifferent to that. I'm not asking you to be indifferent to it, he said. I'm asking you what you want to build, not what you want to correct, what you want to build. She looked at him with the full weight of 30 years of patient, intelligent, entirely justified purpose, and beneath it, something that had been there since the 12-year-old in the recalibrating city. Something that the purpose had been built on top of but had not extinguished, because the things that make people pay attention for 30 years are not only grievance. They are also, underneath the grievance, the shape of what the grievance damaged, the thing that was there before the damage and that the person has been carrying, beneath the strategy and the architecture and the careful legal patience, all along. I don't know, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said in a long time. She could feel it in the saying, the specific, unfamiliar lightness of a true answer to a question she had been avoiding. He nodded. That, he said, is where I think we start. She looked at him for a long moment. This human analyst with his 42-page documents and his 17 additional pages and his stubborn, accurate, inconvenient pattern recognition, who had walked into her meeting room and declined to tell her she was wrong and declined to ask her to forgive, and had instead asked her the question she had been avoiding since before she had the power to build anything. You are, she said, a significant inconvenience. I've been told, he said. By whom? My director, he said. Regularly. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile, not yet, but the structural precondition for one. The specific quality of someone who has not laughed in a professional context for long enough that the muscles involved have forgotten they are available. Sit down, she said. We have a great deal to discuss. He sat down. Outside, the corridor continued its operations. The trade agreements held their positions. The architectural adjustments waited in their patient, legal, precisely calibrated formation for the instructions that would either continue them or revise them. Instructions that had not yet been given, and that would depend on the outcome of a conversation.